Miracles are sometimes born in the icy waters of a raging river. That morning, under the scorching New Mexico sun of 1853, Eleanor Carter felt the desert wind caress her auburn hair as she approached her fish traps, unaware she was about to change the course of two worlds. Eleanor plunged her hands into the cold water of the Rio Pecos, checking the traps she had set at dawn. The July sun was already turning the air into a furnace, but here, near the shaded bank, the coolness lingered like a blessing. Her agile fingers untangled the soaked ropes, hoping Providence would offer her something to feed her table that evening. At 29, she had learned that survival demanded small daily rituals, checking the traps at sunrise, watering the vegetable patch before the heat became unbearable, feeding the hens that were already clucking in their coop. Since the death of Thomas and their little Sarah during the typhoid fever epidemic, these repetitive gestures had become her anchors in a world that had lost all meaning. The sound of the water almost masked the dull pounding that approached. Eleanor looked up, squinting upstream. A rider was galloping along the rocky bank, his horse moving with an urgency that betrayed flight rather than a simple ride. Even from a distance, she could distinguish the long black hair streaming behind him and the slender silhouette typical of Plains warriors. Comanche. Her heart tightened. Red Hollow constantly buzzed with terrifying tales of this tribe, of bloody raids and scalps taken. Yet something in the rider's posture didn't match the stories of terror. He seemed to be fleeing, not attacking. Suddenly the horse stumbled. Its hooves slipped on the wet stones of the bank, and the animal collapsed with a whinny of pain. The rider was thrown into the tumultuous waters, disappearing for an instant before resurfacing, struggling against the current that pulled him towards the rapids downstream. Eleanor sprang to her feet. All the dreadful stories, all the warnings echoed in her head, but a simpler truth prevailed. A man was drowning before her eyes. Without thinking, she tore willow branches from the bank, ripped a piece of her linen skirt to tie them together. Her hands trembled, but urgency guided her actions. The man disappeared and reappeared between the rocks, each second taking him further away. "Hold on," she cried in English, then repeated in the little Spanish she knew. "Aguante." She plunged into the icy water, the shock taking her breath away. The current was stronger than she had imagined, but she swam with determination towards where she had last seen the man. Her improvised rope floated behind her like a serpent of hope. The water of the Rio Pecos enveloped Eleanor like thousands of icy needles. Each stroke brought her closer to the warrior who struggled desperately against the eddies. Her lungs burned, but she refused to give up. When she finally reached the man, her strength was already failing her. He was younger than she had thought, probably in his 20s, with finely chiseled features and a bleeding wound on his forehead. His dark eyes stared at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Never would he have imagined that a white woman would risk her life for him. "Grab this," Eleanor gasped, extending the end of her improvised rope. The warrior hesitated for a fraction of a second before seizing the braided branches. Eleanor immediately felt the weight of his body in the current and began to swim towards the bank, pulling with all her might. Her muscles protested. Her soaked clothes weighed her down, but she persevered. When they finally reached the calmer waters near the bank, both collapsed onto the wet sand, gasping for breath. The warm desert wind was already drying their clothes, creating steam around them like a mirage. Eleanor observed the stranger carefully. His deerskin shirt was adorned with colorful beads in patterns she didn't recognize. A necklace of bear claws hung on his chest, and his moccasins were so delicately crafted they seemed sewn by fairies. Nothing in his appearance matched the terrifying descriptions she heard in Red Hollow. You saved me," he murmured in hesitant but understandable English. Eleanor nodded, still too breathless to speak. She noticed that the young man's horse had managed to regain the bank further upstream, limping slightly but alive. "My name is Nakai," he said, rising with difficulty. "Son of Iron Eagle." The name resonated in Eleanor's mind like thunder. Iron Eagle was legendary, even among the settlers, a respected and formidable chief whose wisdom equaled his warrior reputation, and she had just saved his son. "Eleanor Carter," she replied simply, aware of the strangeness of this formal introduction after what they had just experienced. Nakai tried to stand, but grimaced in pain. His right ankle was swollen, and blood still trickled from the wound on his forehead. Eleanor felt her maternal instinct reawaken for the first time in months. "You can't travel in this condition," she declared with surprising authority. "My house is just a few steps away. Let me at least clean these wounds." The young Comanche gazed at her for a long time, as if trying to decipher her intentions. In his eyes shone a keen intelligence, but also a caution acquired through the conflicts between their peoples. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why risk your life for an enemy?" Eleanor pondered the question, surprised she didn't know the answer herself. Perhaps it was loneliness that had driven her, or the memory of her own daughter who would have needed help, or simply because she had recognized something universally human in his eyes. "Because you were no longer an enemy," she replied softly. "You were just someone who was drowning." Eleanor's small adobe and cedar wood house welcomed its unexpected guest in a silence heavy with mutual apprehension. The thick walls kept the coolness even under the relentless sun, and the scent of dried sage floated in the air like a soothing incense. Nakai settled on a chair near the window, observing Eleanor's every move as she prepared compresses. His eyes scanned the details of this white woman's life, the canning jars lined up on the shelves, the herbs hanging from the beams, the silent spinning wheel in a corner. Everything seemed both familiar and foreign to him. "Your husband?" he asked, pointing to a photograph on the mantelpiece. "Died 8 months ago," Eleanor replied without looking up. "The fever. Our daughter, too." The silence that followed weighed heavily with understanding. Nakai nodded slowly. Premature death, he knew intimately. 3 of his brothers had fallen in the last clashes with the blue-coated soldiers. "You live here alone," he stated, more than asked. "I manage." Eleanor delicately applied the compress to his forehead. "And you? What were you doing so far from your territory?" Nakai hesitated. The traditions of his people taught mistrust towards the Wasichu, the white men. But this woman had risked her life for him. She deserved at least a portion of the truth. "I was looking for signs," he finally said. "Traces of soldiers, new encampments. My father had sent me to observe movements near the borders." Eleanor immediately understood the implication. Tensions were worsening in the region, each side watching the other with growing suspicion. Yet sitting in her rustic kitchen, Nakai didn't resemble the formidable warrior of legends. The first day passed in cautious politeness. Eleanor brought him food, cornbread, beans, goat's milk, and was surprised to see him refuse the pork she offered. In return, Nakai shared dried berries from his travel bag, tart and refreshing. On the second day, the ice began to melt. Nakai, whose ankle was better, accompanied her to the vegetable patch. He stopped in front of the stunted corn plants, frowning. "You plant against the wind," he observed, "and too close to the salty earth." Eleanor looked at him, intrigued. "How do you know that?" "The wind carries the stories of the earth," Nakai explained, kneeling beside a plant. "Here it comes from the southwest. It brings drought and salt from the dried lakes. Your plants struggle against it instead of dancing with it." He showed her how to read the invisible signs. The direction of the tall grasses, the color of the earth to the touch, the places where birds came to drink. His expert hands traced lines in the sand, explaining air currents and pockets of moisture. In exchange, Eleanor taught him her own secrets, how to prepare compost that would enrich the soil, why certain plants grew better together, how to preserve meat in salt and herbs. She also showed him her hens, chuckling softly when he flinched at Brunehilde, the most aggressive of her fowl. "In our way, we hunt our meals," he said, cautiously keeping his distance from the hen. "We don't keep them imprisoned." "They're not prisoners," Eleanor protested with amusement. "Look." She opened the coop and the hens scattered into the yard, scratching the earth freely. In the evening, they returned on their own to their shelter, attracted by the promise of grain and security. "They choose to stay," Nakai murmured, fascinated. That night, sitting under the stars, they exchanged stories. Eleanor spoke of her life in the East, her journey west with Thomas, their dreams of a prosperous farm. Nakai evoked the vast plains of his childhood, the migrations following bison herds, the wisdom of his father who preached balance between war and peace. The night wind carried their words towards the silent hills, and for the first time in months, Eleanor no longer felt alone. The third morning dawned in a troubling silence. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Eleanor was making coffee in her kitchen when Nakai, standing by the window, suddenly stiffened. "They're coming," he murmured, his voice heavy with a mix of relief and apprehension. Eleanor joined him at the window and felt her blood run cold. A line of riders unfolded on the horizon, their silhouettes shimmering in the morning heat like mirages. At least 70 Comanche warriors, their lances raised towards the sky, advanced in perfect formation towards her property. "Your father?" she asked, her throat tight. Nakai nodded. Iron Eagle never lets one of his sons disappear without looking for him. The thunder of hooves grew closer, making the adobe walls vibrate. Eleanor felt her hands tremble as she instinctively smoothed her dress. In a few minutes she would face the most feared chief of the plains, and all she knew of him came from the terrifying tales spread in Red Hollow. "What will they do?" she whispered. "That depends on what you did for me," Nakai replied, looking at her intently. "My father judges actions, not words." The troop stopped about 100 yards from the house, forming a perfect semicircle. A grizzled man, more imposing than the others, advanced alone. His horse, a magnificent sorrel with war paint on its flanks, danced beneath him with an elegance that betrayed years of complicity. Iron Eagle was exactly as Eleanor had imagined, yet completely different. His features, weathered by sun and wind, spoke of wisdom as much as of battles. An eagle feather adorned his braided hair, and a silver bracelet inlaid with turquoise gleamed on his left wrist. The same metal and stones as in her childhood dreams. Nakai emerged from the house, limping slightly. He addressed his father in their language, words flowing like water over stones. Eleanor understood nothing, but the musicality of their dialect fascinated her. Nakai's gestures accompanied his story. He pointed to the river, then to her, then to the still damp rope resting near the door. Iron Eagle's piercing eyes fixed on Eleanor. She met his gaze, drawing from a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed. The chief dismounted with a fluid movement and approached slowly. "White woman," he said in perfect English, which surprised her. "My son tells me you pulled him from the waters of death." "I did what anyone would do," Eleanor retorted, hoping her voice didn't betray her nervousness. An imperceptible smile touched the chief's lips. "No, not anyone. Many would have watched a Comanche drown and thanked the spirits." He walked a few steps around her, evaluating her like a hawk studying its prey. But his gaze was not hostile, rather curious, as if discovering an unknown species. "You live here alone, far from your people," he continued. "That takes courage. Saving the enemy of your people takes even more." Eleanor felt the weight of the moment. The rest of her life was being decided in these few seconds, under the gaze of 70 silent warriors and a chief whose word was law over thousands of square miles. "He was not my enemy when he was drowning," she said firmly. "He was just a man in danger." Iron Eagle stood still. The desert wind rattled the feathers of his head adornment, and in that tense silence Eleanor heard her own heart beat like a war drum. The silence stretched on, heavy as the hot desert air. Iron Eagle gazed at Eleanor with an intensity that seemed to probe her soul. Behind him, the warriors waited motionless on their mounts like bronze statues under the relentless sun. Suddenly, the chief raised his right hand to the sky and uttered a phrase in Comanche in a voice that carried to the hills. Immediately, all the warriors dismounted in a perfectly synchronized movement. The sound of their moccasins hitting the earth resonated like a giant heartbeat. "What's happening?" Eleanor whispered, disconcerted. Nakai approached her, his eyes shining with emotion. "My father has just declared a ceremony of recognition. It's very rare." Iron Eagle gestured to one of his men who brought a small beaded leather pouch. The chief took out red clay powder and mixed it with water in a gourd. His gestures were precise, ritualistic, imbued with a solemnity that transformed the moment into something sacred. "White woman," he declared, dipping his fingers into the colored paste. "You saved the son of Iron Eagle from the water spirits who wished to take him. By this act, you have proven that your heart knows no blind hatred." He brought his hand to her face. Eleanor felt the coolness of the wet clay as he delicately traced 2 horizontal lines on her cheeks, then a circle on her forehead. "I name you she who saves from swift waters," he continued, his voice resonating with the authority of generations of chiefs. "And I offer you a choice that few of your people have received." The wind suddenly picked up, stirring the dust around them as if to emphasize the importance of the moment. Eleanor felt the grains of sand caress her skin, a mix of softness and roughness that perfectly reflected her situation. "You can come live among us," Iron Eagle explained. "My women will teach you our customs. You will learn to follow the migrations, to read the signs of the sky and the earth. You will become our sister." Eleanor imagined this nomadic life, free but uncertain, far from everything she knew. The idea attracted her as much as it frightened her. "Or," the chief continued, "you can stay here and become something even more precious, a bridge between our worlds, a guardian of neutral territory where conflicts come to die and where understanding can be born." He removed the silver bracelet from his wrist, holding it between them like a sacred offering. The turquoises caught the sunlight, casting blue-green reflections on the red clay of her cheeks. "This bracelet belonged to my grandmother, woman who speaks to the clouds," he recounted with reverence. "She too was a mediator, building bridges between the Kiowa and Comanche tribes when war threatened. If you accept this role, it will rightfully be yours." Eleanor contemplated the jewelry, aware of the symbolic weight it represented. Accepting meant taking on enormous responsibility, becoming the voice of peace in a region where mistrust and violence seemed inevitable. "What would my obligations be?" she asked, her voice firmer than she had hoped. "Learn our language and customs. Teach yours to those who wish it. Serve as an intermediary when tensions threaten to explode," Iron Eagle enumerated. "And above all, never forget that peace is a garden that requires constant care." Eleanor looked around her, her small house, her vegetable patch, the chickens pecking in the yard. Then her eyes fell on Nakai, whose encouraging smile gave her the final courage she needed. "I accept," she said simply. Iron Eagle slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. The metal was warm, as if it held the warmth of all the women who had worn it before her. At that moment, Eleanor felt that she had just changed not only her own destiny, but perhaps that of two entire peoples. 3 weeks passed in intense learning. Eleanor discovered the subtleties of the Comanche language under Nakai's patient tutelage, while Iron Eagle taught her the delicate art of tribal diplomacy. Each morning she touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, drawing strength from this link to the mediating women who had preceded her. The hot wind that constantly swept her property now carried unsettling news. Rumors circulated about the founding of a new town, Silver Creek, built on lands that old treaties guaranteed to the Comanches. Tensions rose like steam above the desert. "We must go there," Iron Eagle declared one morning, his face grave beneath the shadow of his felt hat. Before the young warriors decide to act alone, Eleanor felt her stomach clench. Her first mission as a mediator would be a baptism by fire. She put on her best dress, the one she wore on Sundays before loneliness made Sundays ordinary, and checked that the bracelet was clearly visible on her wrist. The journey to Silver Creek was made in tense silence. Nakai rode beside her, while Iron Eagle led a small group of 12 warriors. Eleanor had insisted that their delegation remain modest, hoping to avoid any provocation. But when they reached the ridge overlooking the new town, a terrifying sight met their eyes. Orange and scarlet flames devoured several buildings, and black smoke rose into the sky like a distress call. Figures ran in all directions, their cries carried by the wind to them. "By all the spirits," Nakai murmured. "What happened?" Eleanor spurred her horse without waiting for an answer. Behind her, the Comanches followed, momentarily forgetting their mistrust in the face of the humanitarian urgency. They raced down the slope in a cloud of dust, arriving in the heart of the chaos in a few minutes. The population of Silver Creek, 50 souls at most, desperately fought the flames that threatened to destroy everything. Eleanor dismounted and rushed towards a group of men trying to form a human chain from the central well. "We're here to help," she cried in English, then repeated in her hesitant Comanche so her companions would understand. A man with a face blackened by soot stared at her in astonishment. "Indians? Here?" "We came to negotiate," Eleanor quickly explained. "But first, let's put out this fire." The urgency of the situation temporarily swept away prejudices. Nakai and the other warriors immediately joined the efforts, their knowledge of teamwork and physical strength proving invaluable. They organized more efficient human chains, used wet blankets to smother the flames, and evacuated the injured with an efficiency that impressed the settlers. Margaret Monroe, the new sheriff's wife, hugged her terrified little girl while directing the evacuation of the other children. Her eyes met Eleanor's, and in that gaze passed a mutual recognition, that of mothers who would do anything to protect the innocent. After 2 hours of fierce effort, the flames were brought under control. The toll could have been dramatic, but the unexpected collaboration had saved most of the town. Only the main warehouse and 2 houses had been destroyed. Eleanor took advantage of this moment of respite to discreetly examine the remains. Something was wrong with the burning patterns. The fire sources seemed too numerous, too scattered to be accidental, and that particular smell still lingering in the air. "Oil," she murmured, bending over a charred piece of wood. Nakai, who had followed her, frowned. "You think someone deliberately started this fire?" "I'm almost certain." Eleanor straightened up, the silver bracelet glinting on her wrist in the fading light. "The question is, who? And why now, just as we were arriving to negotiate?" The evening wind blew ashes around them, carrying with them the smell of destruction and mystery. Eleanor felt she had just discovered the first thread of a much more complex and dangerous plot than she had imagined. The day after the fire, Eleanor rose before dawn to examine the ruins more closely. The night wind had scattered the ashes, revealing details that the previous day's urgency had concealed. Her suspicions were confirmed. Several distinct ignition points, traces of flammable liquid, and most importantly, boot prints that didn't match any of the inhabitants she had met. Nakai joined her silently, his moccasins making no sound on the hardened ground. "You were right," he murmured, observing the tracks. This fire was not accidental. Margaret Monroe approached them, her little girl Sarah clinging to her skirts. The sheriff's wife had a face drawn from a sleepless night, but her eyes shone with fierce determination. "Mrs. Carter," she said, looking intently at the silver bracelet, "my husband would like to speak with you. And..." She hesitated, glancing at Nakai. "Your friend, too." Eleanor nodded. The moment of truth was approaching. Would they be accused of the fire, or had their help the day before opened a breach in prejudices? In Sheriff Monroe's improvised office, the atmosphere was tense but respectful. The man, 50-ish, portly and with tired eyes, studied his visitors with curiosity rather than hostility. "My wife told me you fought like devils to save our town," he began. "Not exactly what you expect from a negotiation with the Comanches." "We don't negotiate with flames, Sheriff," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. "They don't listen to anyone." Monroe chuckled despite himself. "Well said. All right, let's speak frankly. This town is built on disputed land, we all know that. But we have families, dreams. And we have treaties," Nakai calmly interjected, "signed by your government." A heavy silence fell. Eleanor felt the crucial moment arrive, the one where everything could tip towards understanding or conflict. If this story of courage and reconciliation touches you, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel to discover how Eleanor will navigate these opposing worlds. The continuation promises surprising revelations. "What if we look together for who really started this fire?" Eleanor proposed, instinctively touching her bracelet. "Because whoever did it obviously doesn't want to see our peoples make peace." Margaret leaned forward. "You think someone deliberately sabotaged your negotiations?" "I'm convinced of it." Eleanor pulled a charred piece of wood from her pocket. "Smell this. Oil, intentionally poured. And look at these tracks." She spread out a piece of paper on which she had reproduced the footprints found. Nakai added, "Whoever did this knows the region well. He knew exactly where to strike to create maximum panic." The sheriff examined the evidence with a professional's attention. "These boots, I recognize them. That's quality leather, not the kind my constituents wear." "Someone from outside, then," Margaret murmured. "But who would benefit from setting us against each other?" Eleanor exchanged a look with Nakai. The same thought had just struck them. What if someone was profiting from the conflict between their peoples? Someone who had everything to lose if peace settled in the region? The desert wind whistled through the ill-fitting boards of the office, carrying with it the scent of mystery and danger that now hung over Silver Creek. Eleanor's investigations quickly bore fruit. By discreetly questioning the residents of Silver Creek, she discovered that a mysterious man had passed through town 3 days before the fire. No one knew his name, but everyone remembered his fine leather boots and his sorrel horse with peculiar markings. He said he was from Santa Fe to buy hides, Martha Jenkins, the boarding house owner, recounted. But he mostly asked questions about the Indians, when they came, how many there were if they were armed. Nakai, who had been listening from the shadow of the veranda, exchanged an uneasy look with Eleanor. This behavior perfectly matched that of a spy seeking to assess the forces present. Did he leave anything? Eleanor asked, mechanically caressing her silver bracelet. Just this strange coin, Martha replied, pulling a small coin from her pocket. He gave it to my son in exchange for information about the trails leading to the Rio Pecos. Eleanor examined the coin in the fading light. It was a Mexican peso, but stamped with a particular mark she didn't recognize. An intuition prompted her to ask, was he interested in the caves near the river? Martha's eyes widened. How did you know that? He did ask if there were any large enough to store goods, he said. The puzzle began to take shape in Eleanor's mind. A mysterious man, questions about roads and hiding places, a fire intended to prevent negotiations. Everything pointed to someone who had an interest in maintaining instability in the region. That night, Eleanor and Nakai discreetly explored the banks of the Rio Pecos. The night wind carried their voices through the willows, and the full moon transformed the water into a silver ribbon. They quickly discovered what they were looking for. A spacious cave, hidden behind a curtain of vegetation and obviously recently used. Look at this, Nakai murmured, picking up fresh wood shavings. Someone built shelves here. Eleanor examined the rock walls by the light of her lantern. Traces of recent passage were visible everywhere. Footprints in the dried mud, rope residues, and above all, that same smell of oil she had detected on the ruins of the fire. It's a warehouse, she realized. But for what? Her answer came in the form of an object forgotten in a corner, a bottle of contraband whiskey labeled in Spanish. Eleanor turned it in her hands, noticing the peculiar seal stamped in the glass. Contraband, Nakai said, understanding immediately. Someone is using these caves to smuggle illegal goods. And our mysterious visitor is part of the network, Eleanor completed. But why sabotage the negotiations? What does it have to do with his trade? The answer came to them as an obvious truth. If the Comanches and settlers made peace, they would establish joint patrols, better monitor the borders, and control passages. Illegal trade would become infinitely more difficult. He needs us to remain enemies, Eleanor murmured, clutching the silver bracelet on her wrist. Our peace threatens his profits. The wind suddenly picked up, rustling the willow leaves like a warning. Someone else knew these caves, someone who would stop at nothing to protect his interests. And Eleanor had just realized that she had become his main target. The name Jonas Vega emerged 3 days later, spoken by a nervous young Comanche who appeared at Iron Eagle's camp. Swift Eagle, barely 18, had the evasive gaze of one who carries a heavy secret. Speak, son, the chief encouraged him, as Eleanor and Nakai listened attentively. A man approached me and my friends, the young warrior confessed. He offered us rifles, powder, blankets, in exchange for bearskins and copper from the sacred hills. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. The plundering of sacred lands was a sacrilege that could push even the most moderate to war. This man, Swift Eagle continued, his name is Jonas Vega. He says he knows secret routes where the white soldiers never patrol. Iron Eagle clenched his fists. And you accepted? Only twice, the young man admitted, ashamed. But when we heard you were negotiating peace, we got scared. Vega was furious. He said the treaties would ruin everything, that the talks had to be stopped at all costs. Eleanor exchanged a look with Nakai. The puzzle pieces finally fit together. Jonas Vega was the name they sought, the man who profited from conflict and sabotaged their reconciliation efforts. Where do you meet him? She asked. In the caves near Devil's Canyon, a half-day's ride to the west, Swift Eagle replied. He stores his goods there and meets his clients. The warm wind blew through the camp tents, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. Eleanor touched her silver bracelet, drawing strength from this link to the mediating women who had preceded her. We must stop him before he causes more damage, she declared. This man is dangerous, Iron Eagle warned. He has accomplices, weapons, and no scruples. How do you intend to confront him? Eleanor thought for a moment, observing the worried faces around her. The solution lay not in violence, but in exposing the truth. By using his own strategy against him, she finally said. "He manipulates by sowing discord. We will stop him by uniting our forces and exposing his lies in broad daylight." Nakai smiled, immediately understanding her plan. A public confrontation. Exactly. But first, we need to gather irrefutable evidence. Eleanor turned to Swift Eagle. "Would you agree to lead us to Devil's Canyon as a witness to his activities?" The young warrior nodded with determination. "I will amend my wrong. It won't be necessary for you to expose yourself to danger," a female voice intervened. Margaret Monroe appeared at the tent entrance, accompanied by 2 other women from Silver Creek. "We too want to see this scoundrel pay for the burning of our town." Eleanor smiled, touched by this unexpected solidarity between women from different cultures. The bracelet on her wrist glinted in the subdued light of the tent, a reminder that the bonds between peoples could be stronger than divisions. "Then let's unite our forces," she declared. "It's time to show Jonas Vega that peace has more allies than he believes." The expedition to Devil's Canyon set off before dawn, in the muffled silence of early morning. Eleanor rode between Nakai and Margaret Monroe, their 3 mounts moving cautiously over the rocky terrain. Behind them, Iron Eagle and 6 warriors followed at a respectful distance, ready to intervene if necessary. The morning wind carried the pungent scent of sage and juniper, mixed with something more unsettling, the smoke of a recent fire. As they approached the canyon, they discovered a temporary camp with the still hot embers of a hastily abandoned fire pit. "He was here recently," Nakai murmured, examining the tracks. But something made him flee. Eleanor dismounted and inspected the surroundings. Broken crates littered the ground, their contents scattered by the wind. Cartridges, bottles of liquor, fine fabrics that had no business in this isolated region. But what caught her attention was the paper wedged under a stone, partially burned. "A letter," she said, carefully unfolding it. The words were in Spanish, but clear enough to be understood. "Negotiations with the savages. Prevent at all costs. New delivery scheduled. Caleb Monroe." Margaret read over her shoulder, recognizing her own son's handwriting. My God, Caleb is corresponding with this man. The silence that followed was heavy with terrifying implications. The sheriff's son, manipulated by Jonas Vega, had become his informant in Silver Creek. Margaret collapsed onto a rock, her face in her hands. "He's been betraying us from the beginning. He told Vega when you would arrive to negotiate." Eleanor knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The silver bracelet gleamed on her wrist, reminding her that even in the darkest moments, reconciliation remained possible. "Your son was manipulated," she said softly. "Vega knows how to exploit fear and prejudice. Caleb is just another victim. A victim who could get us all killed," Nakai growled, pointing towards the valley. Below, a column of dust rose into the still air. Jonas Vega was returning, accompanied by about 10 armed men and a young man whom Margaret immediately recognized. "Caleb," she breathed. The trap was perfect. Vega had used his influence over young Monroe to lure Eleanor and her allies into this isolated canyon, far from any help. But by orchestrating this ambush, he had also made a fatal mistake, publicly revealing his true intentions. "They've seen us," Iron Eagle observed, discreetly joining the group. Eleanor straightened up, adjusting her dusty dress with a dignity that impressed her companions. The decisive moment was approaching, when she would have to draw on all her wisdom as a mediator to transform this violent confrontation into a liberating revelation. "Perfect," she said calmly. "Let him come." It's time Jonas Vega discovered what a woman determined to preserve peace can do. The desert wind suddenly picked up, raising a cloud of red dust that seemed to envelop the entire canyon in a dramatic veil. The final confrontation was about to begin. Jonas Vega emerged from the dust cloud like an evil apparition. The man was more imposing than Eleanor had imagined, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of dangerous living, with cold eyes that betrayed a cruel intelligence. His men flanked him, rifles in hand, while Caleb Monroe rode by his side, his gaze evasive and ashamed. "Well, well," Vega sneered, stopping a few yards away. "The famous mediator and her savage friends. You seem to have lost your way." Eleanor stepped forward, ignoring the weapons pointed at her. The silver bracelet on her wrist caught the morning sun's rays, casting reflections that danced on the canyon's rock walls. "We were looking for the truth, Senor Vega, and we found it." The man let out a humorless laugh. "The truth? The truth is that your little peace negotiations will ruin years of prosperous trade. Do you really believe the people here want your reconciliation? Ask them," Margaret Monroe retorted, rising, her eyes burning with maternal anger. "Ask the mothers of Silver Creek if they prefer fear or peace for their children." Caleb flinched, hearing his mother. "Mom, you were manipulated, my son," she said softly, but firmly. "This man exploited your fears to serve his interests." Vega clicked his tongue impatiently. "Enough of this sentimentality. You've discovered my business, fine. But who will believe you? An Indian, an isolated widow, and a few hysterical women? I will believe them." All eyes turned to the canyon entrance. Sheriff Monroe appeared, accompanied by a dozen Silver Creek residents and, to everyone's surprise, several other Comanche chiefs who had come as reinforcements. Eleanor smiled. Her plan was working. By leaving clues to their destination, she had hoped that reinforcements would find them in time. "Father?" Caleb stammered, suddenly realizing the enormity of his betrayal. "We found your letters, son," the sheriff replied sadly. "And we saw the evidence in the caves." Vega immediately understood that the situation was slipping away from him. His men, seeing the arrival of reinforcements, began to lower their weapons. A fight in this narrow canyon would turn to their disadvantage. "You don't understand," he tried one last time. "Without me, without my trade, this region will fall back into barbarism. Indians and whites cannot coexist." "You are mistaken," Iron Eagle declared, advancing majestically. "We already coexist, look around you." Indeed, the canyon was now filled with an extraordinary sight. Comanches and settlers side by side, united in the same goal of justice. Margaret Monroe stood near a Comanche woman, both mothers protecting the future of their children. Eleanor raised her hand and silence fell naturally. The desert wind carried her clear voice to the rock walls. "Senor Vega, your time is over. Peace is no longer a dream. It is a reality." The smuggler's shoulders slumped. Surrounded, exposed, he had no choice but to surrender. 2 weeks after Jonas Vega's arrest, Silver Creek hosted an unprecedented event in New Mexico history. Representatives from 5 different tribes and 7 pioneer towns converged on the small settlement to attend the Great Peace negotiations. Eleanor stood on the porch of her small adobe house, transformed into a diplomatic headquarters. The silver bracelet on her wrist glinted in the morning sun as she watched the camp being set up. Colorful teepees stood alongside canvas-covered wagons, creating a fascinating cultural patchwork. "Are you nervous?" Nakai asked, approaching her. "Terrified," Eleanor confessed with a smile. "But also excited. Look at them all. A few months ago, they would have killed each other on sight." The warm desert wind brought a mix of smells: wood smoke, tanned leather, exotic spices, and fresh bread. Each group had brought their culinary traditions, and the women had spontaneously organized a trading market. Margaret Monroe joined Eleanor, carrying a tray of still warm biscuits. Since the revelation about her son, she had transformed into an ardent defender of reconciliation. "The Comanche elder, Silent Owl, wishes to speak with you," she announced. "She has concerns about the children's education." Eleanor nodded. This point was crucial. How to preserve the traditions of each culture while allowing new generations to grow together. The meeting took place under a large century-old oak tree, in whose shade a dozen women from both camps had gathered. Silent Owl, an elderly woman with white hair braided with feathers and beads, spoke in hesitant but expressive English. "White children only learn words from books," she said. "They no longer know how to listen to the wind, read the stars, respect the Earth Mother." Margaret frowned. "And our children need to learn to read and count to survive in the modern world." A tense silence fell. Eleanor felt that the future of the negotiations hinged on this seemingly innocuous conversation. She touched her silver bracelet, seeking inspiration in the wisdom of her predecessors. "What if we created a different kind of school?" she suddenly proposed, "where Comanche children would teach about nature and the stars, while white children would share reading and arithmetic." Silent Owl's eyes gleamed with interest. "Continue." "Each child would learn both languages, both ways of seeing the world." Eleanor elaborated, encouraged by the general attention. They would become living bridges between our cultures. Margaret leaned forward. A traveling school? That would follow the seasons? Exactly. Winter in Silver Creek for indoor lessons, summer on the plains to learn from nature. A murmur of approval swept through the assembly. This audacious idea captivated even the most skeptical. My grandchildren, Silent Owl murmured. They would know both worlds without losing either. The wind rose, rustling the oak leaves like a natural applause. Eleanor smiled, feeling that another miracle had just happened before her eyes. The day of the final negotiations dawned in an electric atmosphere. Eleanor adjusted her best dress and checked that the silver bracelet was clearly visible on her wrist. Today, she represented not only the hope of peace but also all the mediating women who had preceded her. The Grand Assembly gathered in the center of Silver Creek, in a circle of chairs and blankets arranged under the open sky. Iron Eagle sat opposite the town mayor, while the other chiefs and representatives formed a human rainbow of diverse cultures. Eleanor spoke first, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. We are gathered here not as enemies, but as neighbors. Recent events have shown us that our true adversaries are neither the Comanches nor the settlers, but those who profit from our divisions. A murmur of approval ran through the assembly. The Jonas Vega affair had opened many eyes. The negotiations lasted 3 intense days. Every point was debated with passion but respect. Hunting grounds, trade routes, rites of passage, protection of sacred sites. Eleanor served as an interpreter not only linguistically but culturally, explaining nuances that words alone could not convey. The most tense moment arrived when territorial boundaries had to be defined. Some settlers demanded total access to the valley, while young warriors refused any compromise. Borders are merely lines drawn by fear, Eleanor intervened when voices began to rise. What if we thought in terms of sharing rather than possession? She pulled out a map she had prepared, showing the region divided into seasonal zones. The Comanches retained access to the northern territories for their winter encampments. The settlers settled in the south, and a central zone remained open to both communities for trade and encounters. Mixed patrols would monitor the whole area, Nakai proposed. Comanches and whites together to protect this shared territory. The idea caused a sensation. No one had ever imagined intercultural law enforcement. Caleb Monroe, who had attended the debates in silence since his arrest was avoided thanks to his mother's intervention, suddenly stood up. I would like to apologize publicly, he declared, his voice trembling. I let fear and prejudice guide my actions. If you accept me, I would like to be part of these mixed patrols. A moved silence greeted his words. Iron Eagle slowly rose and approached the young man. The courage to admit one's mistakes is worth all warrior feats, he said, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You will be welcome among us. The desert wind blew at that precise moment, carrying away the last traces of mistrust. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes, seeing the impossible become reality. The agreement was signed at sunset, each chief affixing his mark according to his tradition. When it was Eleanor's turn, she dipped the quill in ink and traced her name with a steady hand, feeling the weight of history in that simple gesture. 6 months after the signing of the historic agreement, Eleanor stood on the porch of her small adobe house, observing a sight that warmed her heart. In her vegetable garden, Comanche and white children worked side by side, their laughter carried by the warm spring wind. The traveling school had become a reality. Every morning a dozen children gathered at her home to learn both letters and the secrets of the earth. Sarah Monroe, Margaret's daughter, patiently explained the alphabet to Little Bear, while he showed her how to recognize medicinal plants. Mrs. Eleanor, a joyful voice called. Nakai approached on horseback, a wide smile illuminating his face. The patrols report that the trade routes have never been safer. Not a single incident in 3 months. Eleanor smiled, mechanically caressing the silver bracelet that never left her wrist. This ancestral jewelry had seen so many women work for peace before her, and now it bore witness to a new era of cooperation. And Jonas Vega? She asked. Sentenced to 5 years in prison in Santa Fe, his smuggling network has been completely dismantled. Nakai dismounted and leaned against the railing. Iron Eagle says you should be proud. Your name is already sung in the camps of other tribes. This remark made Eleanor think. Emissaries from other regions had come to see them, curious to understand the miracle of Silver Creek, territories where Apaches and farmers were still fighting, where Navajos and miners clashed over water. "I received a letter from Fort Sumner," she said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "They're asking if I could come help them. Tensions with the Navajos are worsening every day." Nakai looked at her attentively. "Would you go?" Eleanor gazed at the horizon, where the hills faded into the heat haze. Somewhere out there, other communities suffered from the same mistrust and misunderstandings that had almost destroyed Silver Creek. "My role as a mediator doesn't end here," she murmured. "If this peace can spread elsewhere, then we will accompany you," a voice declared behind her. Margaret Monroe was climbing the porch steps, followed by Silent Owl and several other women from both communities. "We too have learned," Margaret continued. "This reconciliation is not your work alone. It is all of ours." Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. These women, yesterday still strangers to each other, now formed a family united by common hope. The desert wind rose, softer than she had ever felt it, carrying promises of a future where differences would be riches rather than sources of conflict. She looked up at the clouds dancing in the infinite New Mexico sky, then clasped the silver bracelet between her fingers. Her mission as a mediator was just beginning. Has this story of courage and hope touched you? Don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel. Give us a thumbs up and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories of reconciliation and humanity.